It's growing. That's not what my data predicted. Ashton stepped off the ramp of the orbital lander and onto the parched, cracked soil of Valos Prime, and the environmental sensors in Teyla's hand immediately began to scream. She adjusted the frequency of her scanner, her violet eyes widening as the holographic readout displayed a sudden, violent spike in the subterranean fungal network. The local flora, which had remained dormant for 3 centuries, began to push through the calcified crust around his heavy boots. Teyla looked up, her azure skin flushing a deeper shade of indigo as she took in the broad-shouldered human. He carried a heavy rucksack as if it weighed nothing, his movements fluid and filled with a raw, kinetic energy that seemed to vibrate through the very air. She had spent a decade modeling the ecological collapse of this world, and her data had predicted another century of sterile dust. "You are the stabilizer," Teyla said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am Ashton," the man replied, his voice a deep rumble that resonated in her chest. "Where do you want me to start?" he asked, stepping closer. As he moved, a patch of bioluminescent moss bloomed beneath his heel, spreading in a rapid, verdant circle that defied every law of xenobiology Teyla knew. She watched the green light crawl up the hem of his tactical trousers, feeling a strange heat blossom ignite in her own core. Her people, the Aethel, were creatures of logic and cold efficiency, but this human felt like a walking sun. "The central spire is failing to hold the atmosphere," Teyla managed to say, gesturing toward the looming structure. "My data predicted total failure within 48 hours, she added, trying to regain her professional composure. Ashton looked at the spire and then back at her, a confident smirk playing on his lips that made her breath hitch. "Data doesn't account for human grit," he said, reaching out to steady her as a tremor shook the ground. His hand was warm, the skin rough and calloused against her silk-smooth wrist, and the moment they touched, the scanner in her other hand erupted in a new set of alerts. The growth rate of the surrounding ecosystem had just doubled again. They moved toward the research hab, the silence between them thick with a tension that felt almost physical. Inside the cramped, metallic confines of the lab, the air felt recycled and thin, yet Ashton seemed to fill the entire space with his presence. Teyla watched him shed his heavy outer gear, revealing a charcoal-colored undershirt that clung to the hard lines of his torso. Every muscle seemed honed for high-intensity labor, a stark contrast to the slender, delicate frames of her own kin. She found herself staring at the pulse point in his neck, her own golden markings beginning to glow with a rhythmic intensity she couldn't suppress. It was a physiological response to a dominant biological signature, something her species only experienced during rare mating cycles. "The atmospheric processors are jammed," Teyla explained, her fingers dancing over the touchscreens. "The friction in the gears is too high for the lubricants we brought," she continued. Ashton leaned over her shoulder to look at the schematics, his heat radiating through her back. "We don't need more lubricant," he said, his breath ghosting against the sensitive tip of her pointed ear. "We need to bypass the friction altogether by overclocking the magnetic suspension," he suggested. Teyla turned to look at him, her nose inches from his. "That would require a level of power stability we don't have," she whispered. "I'll provide the stability," Ashton countered, his gaze dropping to her lips. He reached past her to manipulate the controls, his arm brushing against her chest, and Teyla felt a jolt of static electricity that made her knees weak. She grabbed the edge of the console to stay upright, her mind racing as she realized the sensors were now reporting a localized surge in bioelectric energy, centered entirely on the 2 of them. A sudden alarm blared through the hab, a deep, resonant klaxon that signaled a containment breach in the lower levels. The ground buckled, throwing Teyla forward, but Ashton caught her in his arms, his grip firm and protective. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave into a low, predatory growl. They hurried down the service ladder to the reactor core, where a massive coolant pipe had buckled under the sudden seismic pressure. Frigid gas hissed into the room, obscuring their vision in a thick, white fog. Teyla felt the cold biting at her skin, but Ashton didn't flinch. He moved toward the rupture, his movements a blur of calculated action. "I need to seal this manually," Ashton shouted over the roar of the escaping gas. "The pressure is too high for a standard patch," Teyla cried out, her eyes stinging. Ashton didn't answer with words. Instead, he grabbed a heavy metal pry bar and used his own body weight to force the buckled plates back into alignment. Teyla watched in awe as his muscles strained, the veins in his forearms bulging with a strength that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. He was pushing against thousands of pounds of pressure, his face set in a mask of grim determination. "Now, Teyla, weld it," he yelled. She grabbed the thermal torch and moved in, her hands shaking as she worked inches from his straining hands. The heat from the torch combined with the heat of his body created a sweltering microclimate in the freezing room. As the last seal took hold, Ashton let out a sharp exhale, his chest heaving as he slumped against the warm pipe. Teyla dropped the torch and reached for him, her hands roaming over his shoulders to check for injuries. "You are hurt," she said, seeing the frost burns on his palms. "It's just a scratch," Ashton replied, but his eyes were dark with an intensity that stopped her breath. He pulled her closer, the adrenaline of the moment shifting into something far more volatile. "Why did you do that?" Teyla asked, her voice a mere whisper. "Because you were in danger," he said, his hand sliding up to cup the back of her head. The twist hit her then, sharp and undeniable. It wasn't just the planet reacting to him. The sensors in her suit were transmitting to the HAB's main computer, and the data was clear. The planetary growth wasn't a random response to a human presence. It was a response to his emotional state. The world was literally blooming because he felt a protective, possessive urge toward her. "The data, it's not just the planet," Teyla stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's growing, that's not what my data predicted," she said, referencing the massive surge in the life sign monitors. Ashton leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "What did it predict?" he asked, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Stagnation, decay, and eventual silence," she answered. "Humanity doesn't do silence very well." Ashton said, his voice dropping to a seductive purr. He kissed her then, a hard, demanding pressure that tasted of iron and salt. Teyla let out a soft moan, her fingers tangling in his damp hair as she pulled him closer. The room around them seemed to dissolve as the planetary resonance peaked, the very walls of the HAB vibrating in sympathy with the surge of passion between them. He lifted her easily, setting her on a work table and stepping between her thighs. The suggestive weight of his body pressed against her, and Teyla felt a desperate need to be even closer to this creature of fire and will. "We should go to my quarters," she managed to say between gasps. "I don't think we're going to make it that far," Ashton replied, his hands sliding under the hem of her tunic. His skin was scorching, and where he touched her, the golden markings on her body flared into brilliant, blinding light. She felt his hands on her hips, his fingers digging into her flesh with a hunger that matched her own. The sheer scale of what was happening began to dawn on her. Their intimacy wasn't just a personal moment. It was a catalyst. Outside, the dying world was transforming into a lush, green paradise in a matter of minutes, fueled by the raw, unbridled energy of human desire. They moved with a frantic, desperate grace, shedding clothes, until there was nothing left but skin on skin. Ashton's body was a map of scars and hard muscle, a testament to a life lived on the edge of the galaxy. Teyla felt fragile yet empowered in his shadow, her senses overwhelmed by the scent of wood smoke and leather that seemed to cling to him. As he entered her, a wave of golden energy erupted from the HAB, a visible pulse that rippled across the surface of the planet. It was a galactic-scale event, a biological supernova triggered by the union of two species that should never have met. Teyla threw her head back, her voice joining with the low, rhythmic thrum of the planet's heart. The pleasure was a physical weight, a crushing, beautiful force that redefined her understanding of existence. Ashton moved with a primal, rhythmic power, his eyes never leaving hers as he drove them both toward a shared precipice. "You are incredible," he groaned, his voice breaking. "I have never felt anything like this," Teyla cried out, her body arching beneath him. The data on her discarded scanner showed the oxygen levels of the planet skyrocketing, the carbon dioxide being scrubbed from the air by a forest that was growing miles every second. They were terraforming a world through the simple, ancient act of love, a feat of human ingenuity that no machine could ever replicate. It was HFY in its most intimate form. The human spirit, when fueled by passion, could breathe life into the void. As the final wave of release washed over them, the planet's atmosphere stabilized into a perfect, breathable equilibrium. Ashton collapsed against her, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her own. They lay there in the quiet of the lab, the only sound the distant, rustling of leaves where there had once been only wind and dust. "We did it," Teyla whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and wonder. "We saved it," she added. Ashton lifted his head, a weary but triumphant smile on his face. "No," he said, kissing her forehead. "We made something new," he corrected. But their peace was short-lived as the long-range scanners suddenly detected a fleet of hegemony ships dropping out of warp in the upper atmosphere. The alien empire had noticed the sudden bloom of life and had come to claim the weapon that had caused it. Ashton was on his feet in a second, his protective instincts flaring back to life. He reached for his trousers and his sidearm, his eyes scanning the monitors. "They're coming for the planet," Teyla said, her fear returning. "They won't have it," Ashton promised, his voice cold and hard. He turned to her, his hand reaching out to pull her up. "Can you link the spire's output to the planetary defense grid?" he asked. "The grid is offline, it has been for centuries," she replied. "Then we'll bring it back online using the same energy that just terraformed this place," Ashton said, his mind already working through a dozen tactical scenarios. "It's just a different kind of growth," he added. They raced back to the central spire, the sky above them darkening as the hegemony troop carriers began their descent. Teyla worked at the ancient terminals, her fingers flying as she attempted to bridge the gap between human bioenergy and Aethel technology. "I need a massive surge to jumpstart the capacitors," she shouted. Ashton stood at the base of the spire's primary conductor, his hands resting on the cold metal. "Do it," he said. "Ashton, it might kill you," Teyla warned, her heart breaking at the thought. "Humans are harder to kill than your data suggests," he replied, a fierce light in his eyes. "Just think about how much you want me to stay," he added, a wink softening his stern expression. Teyla closed her eyes and focused on the bond they had forged, the memory of his touch and the heat of his body. She felt the energy swell within her, a golden tide that she directed toward the spire. Ashton roared as the power flowed through him, his body acting as a living conduit for the planet's newfound life. The spire erupted in a pillar of blinding light, a localized EMP that fried the electronics of the descending hegemony ships. One by one, the troop carriers lost power and tumbled out of the sky, crashing into the soft, new-growth forests below. The human element had once again defied the predicted outcome, using raw emotion to power a planetary defense system. The remaining hegemony ships, seeing their vanguard destroyed by a literal act of God, turned and fled back into the void. The sky cleared, revealing a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than Teyla had ever seen them. She ran to Ashton, who was slumped at the base of the conductor, his skin glowing with a faint, residual light. "Ashton!" she cried out, falling to her knees beside him. He opened his eyes and coughed, a small, pained laugh escaping his lips. "Told you," he whispered. "I was worried," she said, tears blurring her vision. "Don't be," he said, pulling her into a weak embrace. "I'm not going anywhere," he added. In the days that followed, the story of Valos Prime spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The human catalyst became a legend, a story of how a single man's presence and a single woman's love could resurrect a dead world. Teyla sat on the porch of their new home, a modest structure built into the side of a thriving hill, and looked at her updated data. The growth was still occurring, though at a more manageable, sustainable pace. Ashton walked out to join her, carrying 2 cups of local tea. "What does the data say today?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Teyla looked at the screen and then at the man who had changed everything. "It says that the human factor is the only variable that matters," she answered. She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun set over a horizon that was no longer gray and broken, but vibrant and full of potential. "There's something else," she said, her voice teasing. "What's that?" Ashton asked. "The bioscanners in the hab are reporting a new life sign," she whispered, her hand moving to her stomach. Ashton froze, his cup halfway to his lips. "A new one?" he asked, his voice filled with a sudden, breathless hope. "It's growing," she said, a wide smile breaking across her face. "And I can safely say, that is definitely not what my data predicted," she added. Ashton set the cup down and pulled her into his lap, his large hands cradling her waist with a reverence that made her glow. "Is it a boy or a girl?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's too early to tell," she laughed. But based on the energy readings, it's going to be just as stubborn as its father, she added. Ashton kissed her deeply, a slow, lingering promise of the life they would build together on this new world. The galaxy was a big, dangerous place, but with humanity's unique brand of excellence and their capacity for love, Teyla knew they could face anything. The forest around them seemed to sigh in contentment, the leaves rustling in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. There was no more talk of collapse or failure, only the steady, rhythmic pulse of a planet that had been given a second chance. "I love you, Ashton," Teyla said, her eyes reflecting the stars. "I love you too, Teyla," he replied. "Let's see what else we can make grow," he added. The data had been wrong about many things, but it had been most wrong about the limits of what was possible when a human decided to fight for what they loved. They sat there for a long time, two souls bound by a miracle of biology and spirit, watching the first moon rise over the verdant hills. The legacy of their union would be written in the trees and the rivers of Valos Prime, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most important data is the kind you can't measure with a machine. It was a story of survival, of ingenuity, and above all, of the incredible, transformative power of the human heart. "We should probably name it after someone," Ashton suggested, his thumb stroking her palm. "How about Cashin?" Teyla asked. "I like it," Ashton agreed. "It sounds like a name for a pioneer," he added, and the planet seemed to hum in agreement. As the night deepened, the bioluminescence of the forest began to shine, turning the world into a dreamscape of soft greens and blues. Teyla felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling she had never known in the cold, logical halls of the Aethel Academy. She had come here to study death, but she had found life in the arms of a human. "Tomorrow we start on the Western Plains," Ashton said, his voice sleepy but content. "Tomorrow," Teyla echoed. The work would never be truly finished, but they had all the time in the world, and a love that would only continue to grow, defying every prediction until the end of time.